The village lay in a hollow between two ranges of hills, where the river curved like a snake and the winds carried the smell of dust and smoke. It was a place that appeared peaceful to strangers, a place where women sang while grinding millet, where men sharpened their hoes at dawn, and children ran barefoot through the paths that wound around clay huts. Yet beneath the songs and laughter, there was a silence that pressed against the walls like a heavy shadow. This silence was not the quiet of peace but the hush of things left unsaid, the stillness of truths buried under customs, and the unspoken fear of questioning what had always been done. The villagers called themselves united, but their unity was stitched together with threads of obedience. They respected the elders, the chiefs, and the laws of ancestors, yet that respect often became a mask behind which cruelty hid. Every evening when the fires were lit, tales of old times were told. These stories always praised endurance and obedience, never rebellion. The children were taught to bow their heads to those older than them, even if those elders' hands were harsh. The wives were told to keep their mouths shut, even when their bodies bore wounds. The poor and the weak were instructed to endure, because complaining was believed to anger the spirits of the land. Injustice was not denied, but it was wrapped in words like fate, destiny, or the will of the ancestors. It was easier to pretend that suffering was sacred than to admit that it was human cruelty, raw and deliberate. A traveler once passed through and asked why the women's eyes looked so hollow. The elders laughed and said, "Our women are strong. Their silence is proof of their dignity." But what the elders called dignity was in truth a cage, for silence was demanded, not chosen. No one dared confront a man who beat his wife, for the excuse of tradition was always ready. No one interfered when a stepmother mistreated a child, for they said, "Every home must govern itself." And when orphans suffered, the villagers whispered pity in the dark but turned away in the day. To interfere, they claimed, was to invite curses. In this way, cruelty thrived not because people enjoyed it, but because they clothed it in customs and turned their eyes aside. The rhythm of the village was steady. Work in the fields, gather firewood, fetch water, observe ceremonies. From outside it seemed ordered, balanced, unshaken. Yet in the spaces between there were quiet sobs, bruises hidden beneath wrappers, and children who learned early that to cry aloud was dangerous. They learned that the walls of clay and the thatched roofs could listen and betray them if they spoke too much. So silence became a shield and silence became a chain. The people prided themselves on peace, but it was a peace purchased with the broken voices of those who dared not speak. At the heart of the village stood a sacred tree where disputes were judged. The elders sat beneath it, carving sticks into points while listening to quarrels. Yet their judgments often bent toward power, not fairness. A man with wealth could twist truth in his favor, a woman with no family was unheard, and a child's voice was treated as wind. The tree's roots were deep, yet the justice that was supposed to flow from it was shallow. Still, no one challenged it, for to challenge the elders was to challenge the ancestors, and that was forbidden. Thus, the tree became another symbol of silence, its branches heavy with leaves that shaded injustice rather than revealing it. The villagers believed the land itself saw all things, and that nothing could remain hidden from the spirits who roamed the hills and rivers. Yet strangely, the people themselves turned away from what they saw with their own eyes. A wife limped past them and they lowered their gaze. A child cried out and they busied themselves with chores. They left it to unseen spirits to deal with what they themselves refused to face. In this way, the village seemed alive on the outside but hollow within, like a calabash cracked at the base, holding water but leaking quietly with every breath of time. In such a place, cruelty could live comfortably. It wore the clothes of discipline, it spoke in the voice of tradition, and it carried the authority of elders. Its face was never questioned, its weight never lifted. The people told themselves that this was the way of the world, that suffering had always existed, and that to resist was to invite ruin. Yet the earth itself seemed restless, the wind carried whispers, and the night grew thicker than it should have been. For in that silence, something ancient was stirring, waiting for a voice that could not be ignored. There were times when the moon rose red, and shadows danced longer than usual. The old women muttered that such nights were warnings, but no one listened. The children dreamed of faces in the dark, eyes that glowed without bodies, watching. The chickens clucked uneasily, and the dogs barked at corners where nothing stood. But by day, everything was pushed aside. Life went on, customs repeated themselves, and silence settled once more like dust on the paths. Yet the silence was growing heavy, too heavy, as if it carried the weight of a secret ready to break. The girl, though not yet named by the villagers and stories, was already marked by this silence. She moved like a shadow through the paths, carrying water jars, sweeping courtyards, enduring hands that struck without reason. Her presence was small, almost invisible, and the villagers barely noticed her suffering. But the silence noticed. The silence grew around her like a shroud, and the spirits in the dark began to pay attention. Though the villagers had chosen to ignore injustice, the land itself would not. The silence they worshipped as peace was about to split open, and from within, something strange and terrifying would emerge. And so the village remained, quiet in its cruelty, calm in its blindness, blind in its traditions. The people did not know that they were living at the edge of a story that would shatter their silence forever. For in the very girl they ignored, the fate of their peace was tied. She would not remain invisible for long. Her suffering would not remain hidden. And her silence, unlike theirs, would not be eternal. It would find a voice, not from her lips but from the marks upon her skin, marks that would one day look back at them like eyes in the dark. She had no name that the villagers cared to remember, for to them she was simply the orphan, as if losing her parents had stripped her of identity. Her mother had died when she was still too young to recall the sound of her voice, and her father followed not long after, taken by fever that burned him to the bone. When the mourners left and the drums of death faded, she remained behind with nothing but her small bundle of clothes and the ache of emptiness. It was then that her father's second wife claimed her, not out of compassion but out of duty, and that duty soon hardened into bitterness. The stepmother had daughters of her own, 2 girls with sharp eyes and sharper tongues. They saw the orphan not as a sister but as a servant, someone whose presence was meant to lift their own status. From dawn until moonrise she was given chores that seemed endless, sweeping the compound until the ground was bare, carrying water jars heavy enough to bend her small frame, fetching firewood from forests where even men hesitated to go, scrubbing pots blackened with soot, and grinding grain until her palms bled. Every task she completed only invited another, for the stepmother believed that to spare her even a moment of rest was to let her grow proud. When she rose at dawn, it was not to laughter or warmth but to the hiss of her stepmother's voice. "Up, lazy child. Do you think food will cook itself?" Her stepsisters mocked her with songs while braiding each other's hair, singing verses about the girl who had no mother, who would never wear beads, who would never marry. Sometimes they snatched her food, leaving her only scraps. Other times they hid her chores so that when they were not done the stepmother's stick found her back. Her body bore the marks of cruelty, but her spirit did not shatter. She learned to swallow her pain quietly, for crying out only brought laughter from those who hurt her. Loneliness became her closest companion. She would often sit by the river after fetching water, letting the current carry away her tears. There, she whispered to the water as if it were a friend, telling it secrets no human ear cared to hear. She spoke to the trees too, to the great baobab whose roots were twisted like the veins on an elder's hand. She imagined that the wind listened, that the earth remembered her words even when people forgot. In silence, she built a world where she was not despised but seen, not beaten but loved. Her resilience was hidden in the smallest of acts. Though her stomach ached with hunger, she still shared crumbs with the stray dog that lingered near the compound. Though her hands blistered, she crafted small clay figures when no one watched, shaping them with tenderness as if they were the family she wished for. Though she was treated like dust beneath their feet, she lifted her chin when she walked through the village, determined not to let her shame be seen. The villagers, blind in their silence, noticed none of this. They saw only a thin girl with downcast eyes and assumed she was what her stepmother said she was: lazy, cursed, worthless. But at night, when the compound grew quiet and the stepmother's snores filled the air, the orphan would lie awake staring at the stars. She believed her parents' spirits lived among them, watching. She whispered to them, asking if they could see her suffering, asking why they had left her in the hands of those who despised her. Sometimes she imagined they answered through the rustling of leaves or the sudden cry of an owl. She held on to those whispers as proof that she was not truly abandoned, that somewhere beyond her pain she was still remembered. The weight of her suffering would have broken many, but she carried it with a strange grace. She did not strike back when slapped, nor curse when mocked. Instead, she grew stronger in silence, teaching herself endurance. Every wound hardened her resolve, every insult became fuel for her quiet fire. The stepmother mistook her silence for weakness, but in truth it was her shield. The stepsisters mistook her humility for foolishness, but in truth it was wisdom beyond their years. She had no power in her hands, no voice in the village, no protector at her side. Yet she endured, day after day, shaping her pain into a strength the others could not see. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when her true spirit flickered through. Once, while carrying a jar of water, she stumbled and her stepsisters laughed, expecting her to break down in shame. Instead, she straightened, lifted the jar again and walked with steady steps, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Another time, when accused of stealing food she had never touched, she looked into her stepmother's eyes without trembling, and for a brief moment the woman felt unease, as though the girl's gaze carried a truth too sharp to deny. Yet these sparks were quickly buried beneath chores and blows, and the villagers never saw them. The girl lived as if wrapped in shadows, unnoticed, unwanted, enduring. But even shadows have weight, and the silence of the village that had swallowed so many cries before hers was beginning to strain. Her burden, though carried quietly, was not lost to the world. The river had heard, the trees had seen, the earth had marked every step she dragged across its soil. And though she believed herself forgotten, there was a stirring in the unseen places, a gathering of eyes in the dark, waiting for the moment when her suffering would no longer be hidden. For now she bore her burden alone. But her resilience was not in vain. Each bruise, each tear, each whispered prayer was weaving a story greater than the cruelty meant to erase her. She did not know it yet, but the strength she carried in silence would soon be forced into the open, not by her choice but by the marks her body would bear, marks that would turn her burden into a weapon, her pain into prophecy. It began with nothing more than spilled water. The jar she carried had slipped from her weary hands, shattering on the packed earth of the compound, its cool contents seeping into the dust. For a moment the girl froze, staring at the fragments glistening like scattered pieces of a broken moon. Her stepmother's sharp cry tore through the air before she could bend to gather the shards. "Worthless child. Do you know how precious that jar was? You ruin everything you touch." The stepsisters joined in, their voices like knives, mocking her clumsiness, delighting in the chance to watch her punished. The stepmother's fury ignited like dry grass set aflame. She reached for the stick kept by the doorway, a thick, polished branch that had left its memory across the girl's skin many times before. But this night the blows fell harder, driven not by reason but by the stepmother's own bitterness. Each strike landed with a sound that cracked the silence of the village air, each lash raising welts on the girl's thin back. She stumbled, tried to shield herself with trembling arms, but the stick found her shoulders, her legs, her ribs. The stepsisters watched, their laughter feeding the cruelty, their hands clapping as if it were a game. The girl did not cry out at first. She had learned that screams only encouraged more blows. Instead, she bit her lip until the taste of blood filled her mouth, her silence defiance in its own small way. But the beating grew relentless. Her stepmother's rage was a storm, and she was the ground struck again and again by lightning. Her skin, already marked from days past, began to bruise swiftly, swelling into deep shades of purple and blue. The pain was sharp, then dull, then sharp again until it no longer felt like her own body she inhabited. It was as though she had become nothing but a canvas for cruelty, painted in colors no one should ever wear. By the time the stick fell silent, the girl was curled on the ground, her body trembling like a bird with broken wings. The stepsisters lost interest and wandered away, still giggling. The stepmother spat at the earth beside her and muttered, "Perhaps now you will learn," before turning into the house. The compound quieted, the night wind sweeping over the girl where she lay. Yet the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, watchful, as though the darkness itself had been a witness and could not look away. She tried to rise, but her body resisted. Her skin ached where each strike had landed, throbbing in strange patterns that seemed to pulse with their own life. As she lay there, staring into the night, she felt the bruises swelling, deepening, glowing faintly under the moonlight. It was as if each mark had become an eye, staring outward, unblinking, watching the world in ways she could not. Her breath caught in her throat. She had been beaten many times before, but never had the aftermath felt like this. This pain was different, sharper, fuller, alive. The shadows seemed to move closer, gathering around her. The air thickened, vibrating with something unseen. The bruises throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat, but each pulse whispered to her, faintly, like voices carried by the wind. She closed her eyes, thinking it a trick of pain, but when she opened them the sensation remained. She was no longer just a girl curled in the dust. She was something more, something marked, something chosen. The pain that was meant to silence her had given her a strange, terrible gift. Her skin, turned blue beneath the blows, no longer seemed only wounded flesh. It was as though the ancestors had carved symbols into her body with the stick her stepmother wielded. She was a map of suffering, a vessel for voices beyond the living. The eyes in her bruises stared into the darkness, and the darkness stared back. In that exchange she felt a bond forming between her pain and the unseen world, as though her agony had ripped a veil that separated her from the spirits who lingered in the night. She did not understand what it meant, but she knew her suffering had been witnessed in a way the villagers refused to see. Her bruises had become more than wounds. They had become signs, watching, remembering, refusing to be forgotten. And though her body ached, her spirit stirred with the faintest glimmer of something she had never felt before. Not hope, not yet, but the sense that her pain was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the night, to the silence, to something far greater than her stepmother's rage. That night, when the compound lay quiet and the fires had burned down to ash, the girl lay on her thin mat, her body too heavy with pain to find rest. The walls of the hut seemed to lean in on her, pressing close, as if listening to the shallow rhythm of her breath. Each movement sent a sting racing across her skin, but it was not only the sting that kept her awake, it was the strange sensation that her body was no longer entirely her own. Her bruises, deep and swollen, began to throb with a strange life, pulsing in time with her heartbeat as if they held within them a secret rhythm that belonged to something older than her flesh. The moonlight slipped in through the cracks of the hut, washing her body in silver. It was then she noticed it. Her skin, where the stick had landed hardest, glimmered faintly in the dark. At first she thought it was the trick of her tired eyes, but when she blinked, the glow remained. She lifted her arms slowly and gasped. The bruise, dark and deep, shimmered with a faint light, as though it carried embers beneath the surface. She turned her head, and on her ribs, her shoulders, her legs, the marks seemed to stare back at her. Each bruise had taken the shape of an eye, unblinking, gleaming faintly like coals under ash. She was covered in watchers. Fear coiled in her stomach. She pulled her mat tighter around her body, but the eyes glowed through the fabric, refusing to be hidden. They watched the darkness around her, alert, restless, as if guarding her. The longer she stared, the more she felt them shifting, not on her skin but within her mind. They were not eyes of flesh, but eyes of memory, eyes of the unseen world. She squeezed her eyes shut, trembling, but the whispers began anyway. Soft at first, like the sighing of the wind through dry grass, then clearer, words that seemed to rise from the bruises themselves. They whispered her story back to her, the pain of the blows, the loneliness of her days, the cruelty of her stepmother and sisters. But the voices did not speak only of what had been. They carried warnings heavy with weight. Your suffering is not unseen, they said. Your silence has been heard. The land remembers. The ancestors rise. Each bruise held a piece of the story, each one a vessel carrying the voices of those who had suffered before her. They told her she was not alone, that every cry smothered in silence, every injustice endured, had gathered in her body like water in a clay pot. And now the pot was full. She lay frozen, listening, afraid yet unable to turn away. The voices were not gentle, but neither were they cruel. They were solemn, as if bearing a burden too great to be softened. They told her that her pain was not wasted. It was a message carved into her skin for all to see. Her bruises were not wounds alone, they were words, eyes, warnings. They carried a prophecy she did not yet understand, but she felt its weight pressing on her chest like a stone. Slowly her fear shifted into something else. She realized her body was no longer just hers. It was a canvas painted by pain, yes, but also a tablet of signs, a doorway to the unseen. The stepmother's stick had meant to silence her, to break her. Instead, it had awakened something she could not deny. Her bruises had become a language, one that spoke without her lips moving. And though she did not yet know to whom this message was directed, whether to the villagers, the spirits, or the world itself, she understood that she had been chosen as its bearer. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not only from pain but from the strangeness of it all. She whispered into the dark, "Why me?" But the bruises gave no answer, only glowed brighter, their eyes fixed on the unseen corners of the hut, watching what she could not see. It was as though they belonged to a realm that had always been present, just beyond her sight, now bleeding into her world through her skin. She curled into herself, trembling, both terrified and strangely comforted. For the first time, she knew that her suffering had not vanished into silence. It had spoken. It had answered. She was no longer invisible, not to the spirits, not to the night. And though she did not yet grasp the fullness of what it meant, she sensed that her bruises were not just marks of pain, they were the eyes of the unseen world, and they had chosen her to carry their message into the light. At first the stepmother thought little of it. She had beaten the girl many times before, and bruises were nothing new. But within days she noticed something she could not explain. When the girl moved through the courtyard at night, her skin seemed to carry a faint shimmer, as though fireflies clung to her without flying away. The stepmother dismissed it as her imagination, but unease crept in. She avoided looking too long at the girl's body, for when she did, she swore she saw shapes forming, round, glistening shapes like eyes that stared back. The stepsisters were the first to speak of it openly. One evening, as they braided each other's hair, the younger whispered, "When she walked past me, I felt as though someone else was watching. Not her, something else." The elder sister shushed her, but her own hands trembled, for she too had noticed shadows bending oddly whenever the orphan passed. At night, the sisters complained of whispers outside their hut, whispers that called their names in voices too soft and too many to be human. When they opened the door, there was only the empty courtyard, lit by a moon that seemed too pale, too watchful. Soon the stepmother's nights grew restless. She began to dream of eyes floating in the dark, surrounding her, following her every step. Sometimes she woke with her heart pounding, convinced that the orphan stood at the foot of her mat, staring. But when she looked, the girl was curled in her corner, fast asleep, or at least appearing so. During the day, the stick felt heavier in her hand, and when she raised it, hesitation caught her wrist. The bruises she had created seemed to glare at her, and for the first time, she feared the result of her own cruelty. It was not only within the household that unease spread. Neighbors began to whisper too. They claimed to have heard strange sounds in the night when the girl passed by with water, as if the darkness muttered behind her. One woman swore that she saw the ground darken with shadows where the girl stepped, even though the sun was high. Another said she caught the reflection of glowing eyes in a clay pot filled with water after the orphan had leaned over it. The villagers, who prided themselves on silence, could no longer ignore the strangeness that clung to her. Rumors moved quickly, growing with each retelling. Some said she had been cursed, that the spirits of her dead parents clung to her, punishing anyone who wronged her. Others whispered that she had been chosen by the ancestors, that her body was no longer hers but a vessel of judgment. Children were told not to stare at her too long, lest the eyes upon her skin follow them into their dreams. Men lowered their voices when she passed, and women crossed themselves with protective charms. The orphan, who had once been invisible, was now a figure everyone watched but no one dared approach. Inside the compound, fear curdled into resentment. The stepmother scolded her daughters for speaking of ghosts, yet she herself avoided the girl's presence, muttering charms under her breath when forced to give her orders. The stepsisters grew crueler in words but never laid hands on her, their laughter shrill with unease. They began to huddle together at night, claiming the darkness of the hut pressed too heavily on them when alone. Even the family's goat refused to settle near the girl's sleeping mat, choosing instead to bleat restlessly until moved away. The orphan noticed their fear, though she did not understand it fully. She felt the bruises pulsing under her skin like hidden drums, alive in ways she could not explain. When she passed her stepmother and saw the woman flinch, a strange mix of sorrow and strength stirred within her. For once, the weight of her suffering did not fall entirely on her shoulders, it pressed back onto those who had caused it. Though she remained quiet, the balance in the household was shifting. The silence that had long been her prison was cracking, and through the cracks, the whispers of the unseen world poured, unsettling everyone who had thought her powerless. By the third week, the girl's strange condition could no longer be dismissed as mere accident or imagination. Whispers had carried her story beyond the walls of the stepmother's house, flowing like a hidden current through the narrow paths of the village. The bruises on her arms, shoulders, and back did not fade. Instead, at night, they pulsed faintly, their bluish glow catching the attention of anyone who dared glance in the darkness. It was said that sometimes they formed shapes resembling eyes, wide and unblinking, watching those who came too near. And so the elders were summoned. The village elders were men and women of age, wrapped in woven cloths dyed with earth and leaves, carrying staffs polished smooth by years of use. They arrived in solemn silence one late afternoon, their presence commanding respect and unease. Villagers gathered in hushed clusters, watching from a distance as the elders made their way to the stepmother's courtyard. Even the birds seemed quieter that day, as if the air itself held its breath. The girl stood in the center of the compound, her thin figure still, her eyes lowered. Her bruises, hidden beneath her clothes during the day, gave no sign of their nighttime strangeness. Yet everyone present knew what would happen once the sun fell. The elders seated themselves in a semicircle around her. Their faces were carved with deep lines of wisdom, but also with caution. The eldest among them, a man called Mwanga, spoke first. His voice was heavy and deliberate. "Child, your body carries marks that do not belong to ordinary flesh. We are here to see, to question, and to understand." The girl did not answer. She had grown used to silence, her words swallowed by years of being ignored. Instead, she shifted slightly, her gaze meeting the ground as though it could protect her. The stepmother stepped forward quickly, her voice sweetened with false worry. Honored ones, she is but a stubborn child. She bruises herself with her clumsiness. Perhaps she wishes to draw pity. Children who crave attention invent tricks. Surely you can see this is no more than a foolish game. But even as she spoke, her own daughters refused to meet the elders' eyes. They had been the first to notice how the bruises seemed to glow, how whispers filled the rooms at night when the girls slept. Fear had lodged itself in their bones and they could not mask it. Another elder, a woman with sharp eyes named Nambi, leaned forward. Marks may come from the hand of man, yes. But what hand makes them shine when darkness falls? What human bruise tells stories in the night? No, stepmother, this is beyond clumsiness. The courtyard buzzed with uneasy murmurs. The villagers shifted on their feet. Some nodded at Nambi's words. Others crossed their arms defensively, unwilling to believe. One of the younger elders raised a different possibility. Perhaps she is cursed. Perhaps an evil spirit clings to her, marking her as its possession. If so, the danger is not hers alone, it is ours, all of us, for curses spread like fire through dry grass. At this, some women gasped and drew their children closer. Fear thickened in the air. But Mwanga lifted his hand for silence. There is another way to see this, he said slowly. Not all who carry strange signs are cursed. Sometimes the spirits choose a vessel, a messenger. What looks like suffering may be the sign of a higher purpose. Her bruises may not be wounds, they may be words written by hands unseen. The statement fell into the crowd like a stone into water, sending ripples through every heart. The stepmother's face hardened. If the girl were seen as chosen, her power over her would weaken. She forced a laugh. Spirits do not choose a child such as her. She is nothing but a burden. Believe me, elders, you waste your time. But the elders were not laughing. They rose together, staffs tapping against the earth, and left the courtyard without another word. The villagers followed them with anxious eyes, unsure whether to fear or to revere the girl who stood silently behind. That night, when darkness swallowed the compound, the bruises came alive again. They glowed faintly like smoldering embers, and whispered in tongues only the girl could hear. The words curled in her mind like smoke. They will see. They will all see. For the first time she understood, her bruises were not simply scars. They were messages, and soon the entire village would be forced to read them. That night, when the moon hung heavy over the village and the drums from a distant ceremony echoed faintly in the wind, she lay restless on her mat. The bruises on her body, still glowing faintly in the dark, pulsed like small watchful eyes. She had grown accustomed to their eerie presence, yet tonight something felt different. The air seemed thicker, the silence louder, as though the very walls of the hut leaned closer to listen. Her eyes drifted shut, but sleep did not come gently. Instead, she fell into a space between waking and dreaming, where the boundaries of time and flesh melted away. She found herself standing in a vast plain, one she had never seen before, yet it felt ancient, familiar. The ground beneath her feet was red like blood, and the sky above shimmered with stars that moved like restless spirits. Around her rose the faint outlines of figures, men and women clothed in animal skins, warriors with spears, mothers with children tied to their backs, elders with carved staffs. Their faces were stern, their eyes burning with the same glow as the bruises on her skin. A chill ran through her, but her legs would not move. The air vibrated, and from the shadows voices began to murmur, deep, layered, heavy with authority. At first she could not make sense of them, as if she were hearing many tongues at once. But slowly the words untangled, and she realized the voices belonged to the ancestors, the spirits of those who had lived and died before her, those whose blood coursed through her veins. Child of sorrow, they said, their voices echoing like thunder inside her chest. Your pain has reached us. Tears welled in her eyes, but her lips trembled too much to speak. Still, the bruises on her body glowed brighter, and from them whispers escaped, her voice yet not her own, answering the ancestors, carrying words she did not consciously form. We see the cruelty done to you, the ancestors continued. We see the laughter of the wicked, the silence of those who turned away. Your bruises are not only marks of suffering, they are our eyes opened through your flesh. Through them we look upon the living world once more. Her knees gave way and she fell to the ground, pressing her palms against the red earth that seemed to pulse like a beating heart. Why me? She whispered, trembling. Why was I chosen to bear this weight? A figure stepped forward from among the shadows, an old woman with hair like white smoke, leaning on a twisted staff. Her voice was softer than the others, but carried a power that silenced the night. Because pain carves deep paths, she said. And through those paths we travel. The wicked thought they were breaking you. Instead they have opened a doorway. Your body holds the message we could not deliver until now. You are not cursed, you are the mouth of justice. The girl shuddered, a strange mixture of terror and awe seizing her. What do you want of me? She asked. The voices rose together, a storm of sound that made the stars tremble. We demand justice. Not only for you but for all who suffered silently, for all whose cries were swallowed by the earth. You must carry our voice. You must show them that the ancestors do not sleep. She felt heat spread through her body as though fire had entered her veins. The bruises burned, but the pain no longer felt like torment, it was power. Each mark throbbed with purpose, each whisper became clearer. She realized that she had not been abandoned in her suffering. She had been chosen. The ancestors' chorus quieted, leaving her with the old woman's steady gaze. Do not be afraid, she said. The world will fear you, yes, but it will also listen. And when the time comes, you will know what to do. The dream dissolved like mist and she awoke with a gasp. Her hut was dark, yet the bruises glowed brighter than ever, casting long shadows across the walls. She pressed a hand to her chest, her heart still pounding with the weight of the voices. For the first time she did not weep for her suffering. Instead she sat upright, breathing deeply, knowing she carried something greater than herself. The ancestors had spoken. Justice would rise through her. The days that followed carried an unsettling shift in the girl's spirit. Where once she had lowered her head in silence, too afraid to meet the burning eyes of her stepmother or the sneers of her stepsisters, now her back began to straighten. Her bruises, glowing faintly in the shadows of the night, had become more than marks of pain. They were her shield, her companions, her voices of courage. Every time she gazed at them, she remembered the whispers of the ancestors, the message carried in the pulse of her wounds: stand tall. Justice will rise through you. The stepmother still tried to assert her power. She would shout at the girl, ordering her to fetch water or sweep the compound. But instead of cowering, the girl moved slowly, deliberately, her eyes unblinking, her face unreadable. Once, when her stepsister tried to shove her, she stood firm, not stumbling as before. The stepsister hissed, "Why do you look at me like that?" Her voice trembled, though she tried to mask it with arrogance. The girl said nothing. Her silence now carried weight, sharper than any insult. That night, the bruises grew warm across her arms, almost burning. The voices of the ancestors echoed inside her. Each strike is not weakness, it is proof of what they cannot destroy. With every blow you become stronger and they weaker. The truth of those words unfolded quickly. When her stepmother lifted a stick and struck her across the back, the pain was real, but so was the voice that surged from her bruises, louder than before: stand tall. She turned and faced the woman, eyes blazing with something new, something unshaken. The stepmother faltered, lowering the stick as if her strength had drained away. Fear crept into her expression, though she tried to cover it with rage. The household grew tense. The stepmother and stepsisters still tried to hurt her, but each attempt left them rattled. A shadow would move across the walls, a whisper would curl into their ears, and always the girl would rise again, taller, stronger, unbroken. Their cruelty no longer seemed like power, it seemed like desperation. The girl began to walk differently too. She no longer skulked along the edges of the compound but stepped through the courtyard with a quiet authority, as if she belonged not only to that house but to something greater, something timeless. Children in the village began to notice her too. They whispered that she carried fire in her eyes, that even silence bowed to her. Her abusers began to avoid her gaze. The stepmother, once bold, now muttered to herself when the girl entered the room. The stepsisters pretended to laugh but their voices cracked. The balance of power was shifting. The more they tried to harm her, the more their own fear betrayed them. And in the quiet of night, when the bruises glowed and pulsed like a secret drumbeat, the girl whispered back to the ancestors, "I am ready. I will not bend again." The season of harvest came, and with it, the village prepared for the Festival of Shadows, a night when fires were lit, drums thundered, and dancers carried masks of spirits both feared and honored. It was meant to be a celebration of abundance, a time when laughter chased away the fears of drought and hunger. Families decorated their huts with woven mats, gourds filled with millet beer and garlands of wildflowers. Children painted their faces with ash and clay, playing at being spirits. But beneath the merriment, tension stirred, for the whispers of the girl with the bruises had begun to unsettle many. She attended the festival not as a participant but as one dragged along by her stepmother. Her body was fragile, her spirit quieter than most, yet her presence pulled eyes to her without effort. The bruises upon her skin, so many that they seemed like shifting constellations, had begun to take on an unnatural quality. By day they appeared as dark blotches of pain. By night, beneath the glow of torches and moon, they shimmered faintly, like embers buried under ash. Few admitted it aloud, but many had seen it. As drums roared and dancers moved like shadows made flesh, she sat at the edge of the gathering, unnoticed by those feasting but watched closely by children who whispered to one another. Her stepmother hissed for her to sit straighter, to keep her eyes down, but the girl felt a strange pull, an energy rising within her. The bruises on her arms tingled as though alive, as though listening to the rhythms of the drums. Then it happened. When the great circle of dancers reached its peak, when flames flared high and shadows leapt like living things, her bruises began to glow, not faintly now but vividly like coals fanned to life. Purples and blacks shifted into luminous blues and reds. Shapes began to form upon her skin, eyes, dozens of them, unblinking, watching. Gasps erupted around her as people noticed. At first they thought it was a trick of the fire, but as the drumming slowed, the glow grew brighter until there was no denying it. Her skin had become a living canvas of eyes, wide and sorrowful, staring at the village. The dancers faltered. The drums stumbled to silence. Even the children who had laughed moments before shrank back in fear. One of the elders whispered, "The ancestors are looking at us through her." Another muttered, "This is no child, she is cursed." But the silence that followed was heavier than any accusation, for every villager knew that curses did not appear without cause. What the girl's body revealed was something far more dangerous. A mirror. The eyes on her bruises seemed to shift and focus on different faces in the crowd. Men who struck their wives felt their throats tighten. Women who beat their children trembled under the gaze. Secrets hidden within the walls of huts seemed suddenly exposed beneath that unyielding stare. The festival, meant for joy, had become a trial by firelight. The stepmother tried to pull the girl away, but the child's feet rooted to the earth as though she belonged to it. Her lips parted, yet no words came. She did not need to speak, the bruises spoke for her. The glowing eyes blinked slowly, mournfully, like ancestors watching a people who had forgotten compassion. That night, the Festival of Shadows was remembered not for its dancing or songs, but for the moment when the darkness in their homes was dragged into the light. The girl had become the voice of silence itself, and the village could no longer pretend that violence was hidden in the shadows. The shadows were watching. The stepmother and stepsisters had grown desperate. Each day the girl's bruises seemed to grow bolder, glowing like living witnesses to their cruelty. At first they tried to cover them with cloth and ash, but no matter how much they rubbed or pressed, the marks would not fade. Instead, the bruises seemed to multiply, as though each act of violence against her birthed another voice, another eye, another presence that refused to be hidden. Fear crept into the hearts of the wicked women. The stepmother could no longer walk through the village without feeling as if unseen stares followed her. The eldest stepsister swore she heard whispers in the dark, voices chanting her shame. The youngest sister, though cruel in her own way, began to weep at night, trembling when she glimpsed her own reflection, certain that her mother's sins had stained her as well. Their solution was simple in their minds: silence the girl forever. If she cannot live, her bruises cannot speak, the stepmother hissed one night, her eyes burning with desperation. So, under the cover of darkness, they dragged the girl to the edge of the forest, a place where the air was thick with shadows and the ground was said to swallow secrets. They dug a shallow pit, forcing her down, whispering curses as they raised their tools to strike. But the earth itself seemed to resist them. The girl, weak yet unbroken, did not cry out. Instead, her body pulsed with light, and from every bruise an eye opened, wide, unblinking, filled with the fury of ancestors. The stepmother dropped her weapon with a scream. The stepsisters staggered back, clutching their heads as whispers grew into wails, filling the night with the sound of countless souls crying for justice. The bruises were no longer just marks. They had become 100 eyes that moved and followed, never closing, never resting. Wherever the wicked women turned, they saw them, on walls, in puddles, in the blackness of their own eyelids. The eyes did not blink, nor did they fade with the dawn. Madness gripped them quickly. The stepmother wandered the village, clawing at her skin, screaming at invisible watchers. The eldest stepsister tried to flee, but no matter how far she ran, she felt the gaze of the bruises scorching her back. The youngest collapsed in the marketplace, confessing her family's cruelty to all, begging forgiveness that the ancestors refused to grant. The villagers whispered of curses and justice, of the way evil devours itself when it believes it can bury truth. And as for the girl, she stood unharmed, her bruises still glowing, her eyes steady and unafraid. For though she had been beaten, starved, and scorned, she carried within her the voices of those who came before, voices that would never again be silenced. The punishment of the wicked was not delivered by blade or fire, but by the weight of truth made visible, unbearable, inescapable. Their downfall was their own cruelty reflected back at them, multiplied until it consumed them whole. The morning after the downfall of her stepmother and stepsisters, the village awoke to a strange quiet. Whispers drifted through the air like the rustling of dry leaves, retelling the story of how cruelty had devoured itself. But at the center of those whispers was not the ruin of the wicked, it was the girl who had endured it all, whose bruises had once been marks of shame but now shone like sacred seals of truth. The elders called for her to stand before the gathering tree where judgment was usually passed. At first she hesitated. All her life, that space had been reserved for her humiliation, when her stepmother accused her of laziness, or when her stepsisters mocked her supposed weakness. Yet now as she walked forward, the people bowed their heads. The bruises on her arms and face pulsed softly, glowing like the dawn after a long night. One elder, his beard as white as river foam, raised his staff and said, "This child carries not curses but blessings." She was struck, yet she did not wither. She was silenced, yet her body spoke for truth. The ancestors have placed their light upon her. Women stepped out of the crowd carrying baskets. Some were filled with grains, others with colorful cloths, and some with carved beads that glimmered like little suns. These they placed at her feet. Young men brought calabashes of milk, yams, and roasted meat, saying, "No one who has walked through pain with such courage shall ever go hungry again." Then came the proposals. Suitors lined up, bowing low, their voices earnest. Warriors offered her protection, farmers promised fertile land, and even chiefs hinted at marriage alliances. But she, standing tall, looked not dazzled but thoughtful. She remembered every blow, every tear shed in secret, every night she thought she would not survive. She knew now that her story was bigger than herself. She lifted her hands, the bruises still glowing faintly, and spoke with a voice that was steady and clear. "I thank you for your respect and your gifts. But hear me, there are other girls hidden behind walls of cruelty, other children silenced by fear. What good is my rise if I leave them behind? I will not marry yet. My path is to make sure no other soul suffers in shadows as I once did." The crowd murmured in awe. Even the elders, who were rarely challenged, nodded with approval. For her words were not just defiance, they were prophecy heavy with truth. That day she was given a new name by the women of the village, she who protects the helpless. Whenever disputes arose, her voice was sought. Whenever a child cried of mistreatment, her presence was demanded. And whenever cruelty tried to hide in the dark corners of homes, her bruises, still glowing like watchful eyes, forced the village to see. Thus, her honor did not rest in gifts or marriage but in a living legacy. She turned her pain into a shield for others, and in doing so became the voice of all who once could not speak. Her story spread beyond her village, carried by wandering storytellers, whispered by elders around fires, and taught to children as they drifted to sleep. People said her bruises had never been mere marks of suffering. They were voices etched on her skin, voices that cried out against cruelty and injustice. "Bruises do not hide truth, they speak for the voiceless," became the saying that sealed her tale into the soul of the people. Wherever the folktale traveled, it left behind a seed of warning. Cruelty, no matter how carefully hidden, cannot remain unseen. The pain inflicted on the innocent has its own power, a power that rises as witness when the oppressed cannot speak. Those who abuse believe silence will bury their actions, but the silence of the oppressed becomes thunder that shakes the hearts of generations. Her story became a shield for the helpless, a torch for the downtrodden, and a reminder that the hands which strike unjustly will one day tremble under their own guilt. Elders repeated it not only as a tale of tragedy but as one of hope, that no act of cruelty, no matter how secret, escapes the eyes of truth. Mothers told their children to live kindly, to never raise their hands in wickedness, for the bruises of another would one day become a testimony against them. Fathers told their sons that true strength lay in protecting, not in wounding. Her suffering transformed into a lesson that rippled across time, reshaping how people understood justice and compassion. Generations passed, but her name was never lost. It lived in songs, in rituals, in the whispers of women comforting their daughters, and in the warnings of men teaching their sons. The girl who once had nothing, who was beaten, mocked, and silenced, became eternal through the very pain meant to erase her. Each retelling gave her life anew, ensuring that she would never fade, that her bruises would always speak. Her memory became more than a story, it became a vow, binding the hearts of those who heard it to stand against cruelty, to be the voice of the voiceless, and to carry her legacy forward into every dawn.